On November 14th, 1961, a little before 10 o'clock in the evening, a little before 10 p.m., Bumpy Johnson sat in a Harlem supper club staring at the best ribeye he'd seen in years. 15 years in federal prisons had taught him two things: never relax in public and always trust your tongue over your eyes. The first bite tasted perfect, until his teeth brushed against something sharp that should not have been there. In that split second, Bumpy realized this wasn't dinner. Someone had just slipped a death sentence onto his plate. Bumpy left the Red Rooster with a folded napkin in his hand, like it was nothing more than a prop from dinner. Inside that white cloth was everything he needed to know one thing. Somebody in Harlem had just decided they were ready to live in a world without Bumpy Johnson. The Cadillac was already waiting at the curb on 138th. Curtis jumped out, opened the back door, and froze for half a second when he saw his boss's face. Bumpy slid into the back seat, closed the door, and let the silence hang until the engine turned over. Then he spoke, almost conversational. "Someone just tried to kill me," he said. Crowded room. Good music. Full plate. They still took the shot. Curtis felt the back of his neck go cold. He didn't ask more. He just drove. The brownstone on 127th Street was quiet when they pulled up. From the outside, it looked like any other house on the block. Curtain drawn, light in the front room. Inside was a different story. Inside was the place where Harlem got decoded. Bumpy stepped through the door, handed Curtis a look instead of instructions. The kid understood. "Juno. Nat. Bring them. Now." Mayim was in the parlor with a book in her lap. She set it down the second she saw the look in her husband's eyes. No yelling. No panic. Just the heavy calm of a man who had almost died over dinner. Bumpy laid the napkin on the coffee table, opened it, and let the glass glitter under the lamp. Ground down so fine it could pass for salt to anybody who hadn't spent a decade and a half eating in federal cafeterias. "Who?" Mayim whispered. "That's what I've got till sunup to find out," he said. By midnight, the parlor was no longer a family room. It was a war room. Juno Brown came first, shoulders like a retired heavyweight, who never fully retired. He'd been breaking bones for Bumpy since the Dutch Schultz days. Behind him, Nat Pettigrew slipped in quiet, forgettable on purpose, the kind of man who could stand next to you on 135th 3 days in a row and you'd never recognize him. If Bumpy was the brain, Juno was the fist that hit the table, and Nat was the nerves reaching into every corner of Harlem, bringing back what the streets were whispering. Bumpy put the napkin between them like evidence on a courtroom table. "This was on my plate tonight," he said. "At the Rooster. In front of everybody." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room already understood what that meant. Someone hadn't just gone after a man. They'd gone after the whole idea of Bumpy Johnson being untouchable. To understand why that mattered, you have to see the map that only a few men in Harlem ever got to see. In one corner of that invisible map sits the Red Rooster, all linen tablecloths and jazz, where politicians, preachers, hustlers, and movie stars share the same air. That's the living room of Harlem's underworld. If you can eat there in peace, it means your name still carries weight. A few blocks away, there are Italian social clubs where Frank Costello's people play cards and plan expansions. Those rooms don't look like much from the street. Inside, they're playing a different game. Who gets to move numbers? Who controls the liquor? Who gets to step one block deeper into Harlem without getting buried for it? Between these two worlds are the connectors. A barber shop on 116th where more secrets get swept off the floor than hair. A church where men in suits ask God for forgiveness on Sunday morning and negotiate territory by Sunday afternoon. Counting houses on side streets where dollar bills pass across green felt tables before they turn into power. Nat lives on that map. He knows which back door belongs to which bookmaker, which hallway is just a hallway, and which one hides a stash of ledgers behind a loose board. Juno lives on it too. But his version is drawn in bruises and broken noses. When Glass shows up in Bumpy's stake at the Red Rooster, it isn't just an attempt on his life. It's a pin shoved straight into the center of that map, a message that says, "Your living room isn't safe. Your castle has a crack." If Bumpy doesn't answer that message the right way, the lines get redrawn. Suddenly the Italian clubs creep closer. Suddenly men who used to whisper his name start saying it out loud in the past tense. So he gave them a deadline. "By sunrise," Bumpy said, looking from Juno to Nat. "I want a name, a motive, and where they're sleeping tonight. 24 hours. Not just to find out who put glass in his dinner. 24 hours to patch the hole in the map of Harlem before somebody else decided to redraw it without him." November 15th, 6:12 a.m. Nat Pettigrew came back to the brownstone with a folder under his arm and cold air still clinging to his coat. Bumpy was already at the dining table, the same table where he took meetings, counted money, and decided who walked away and who did not. Nat laid the folder down and opened it. 12 names on lined paper. 12 people who had touched a plate, a pan, or a knife inside the Red Rooster kitchen the night before. Cooks, dishwashers, prep, busboys, Nat said. Everybody who was back there when your steak hit the grill. He went down the list. A line or two under each name. A room on 139th. A wife and 3 kids. A side hustle running numbers on the weekend. Just the small facts of small lives trying to survive in a city that did not care if they drowned. Most of them were clean. No real money trouble, no known ties to the Italians, no reason to risk everything just to put glass in a man's food. Then, Nat tapped his finger on one entry. Marcus Bell. Dishwasher. Owes 400 to a lone man up on 142nd. That's a big number for a man who scrubs plates. 400 was enough to get someone's arm broken. Enough to make a man listen if a stranger offered him a way out that involved one quiet job and no witnesses. He slid to the next star. Doy May Franklin, prep cook, brother sitting in Rikers on a short bid. The kind of brother a man might do something stupid for if someone promised to move his court date or change his luck. Bumpy listened, elbows on the table, hands folded like a judge. Marcus. Doy May. Men who lived close to the edge, where a favor from the wrong person could feel like a blessing. Then Nat hesitated before the third name. Clarence Mosley, he said. Head chef. 6 years at the Rooster. No gambling, no drinking problem, no side business. Goes home, goes to church, comes back to work. That's it. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. So why the star? Nat turned the page. There was one more line written in smaller letters. Little brother, Nat said quietly. Name was Delroy. 19. Beaten in an alley off Lenox back in '53. Died 3 days later in Harlem Hospital. The room cooled a few degrees. Juno shifted his weight but didn't speak. Who did it? Bumpy asked. Nat didn't look at him. That was the answer. Men who had nothing to hide looked you in the eye. Some of Juno's boys, Nat said finally. They were chasing a runner who stole from one of your counting houses. Kid matched the description. Wrong coat, wrong block, wrong night. They had hit him in the dark, trying to scare information out of a stranger. The stranger had nothing to give them but blood. By the time anyone realized the mistake, the kid was already slipping away on a metal gurney under bright hospital lights. Juno cleared his throat. We took care of the funeral, he muttered. Told the family it was street trouble. Random. It was an easy word for men who moved pieces on a board. Less easy for a brother who had to stand over a cheap wooden box because nobody in his house could afford better. Bumpy stared at the third name. Clarence Mosley. 6 years of perfect steaks. 6 years of clean white jackets and polite, "Yes, Mr. Johnson," and "Enjoy your meal, sir." 6 years of a man smiling while he cooked for the same empire that had beaten his brother into a hospital bed. He realized, with a weight that sat in his chest, that he had never once asked Clarence about his family. Not really. Not past the small talk about holidays and overtime. To Bumpy, the kitchen staff had always been part of the machinery. You paid them on Thursday. They showed up on Friday. The plates came out hot and on time. If a man had a scar, a limp, a missing brother, that was his business. The only thing that mattered was whether the food was good and the place ran smooth. But people were not cogs. Every one of those 12 names came with its own quiet file of disappointments, debts, and dead relatives. Some hurts sat close to the surface. Some were buried deep under years of routine, like bones under a busy street. Sometimes, all it took was one conversation in the wrong doorway, one whisper outside a church, for an old wound to start bleeding again. Bumpy glanced from Marcus's debt to Doyme's brother, to Clarence's dead sibling and the little note about Harlem Hospital. It was like looking at hairline cracks in concrete. One by one, they didn't seem like much. Put enough of them together, and a whole building could shift. "These 12 people," Bumpy said slowly, "been carrying our plates on their backs for years." He tapped Clarence's name with his fingertip. "And one of them's been carrying a ghost." The question, hanging in the room, was bigger than who had poured ground glass into a ribeye. It was this: when the private war between kings runs straight through the life of a man who just came to work and cook, who ends up paying the highest price. 8 years was a long time to carry a picture in your head. Clarence Mosley carried one anyway. His little brother Delroy, 19, lying on a hospital bed under harsh white lights, lips cracked, ribs wrapped, asking a question nobody in the room could answer. Why me? Back in '53, the doctors had called it trauma, internal bleeding, wrong place, wrong time. The cops had called it street violence, another boy in the wrong alley. The men who swung the bats had called it a mistake and moved on to the next errand for Bumpy Johnson's empire. Clarence never moved on. He just went to work. Sunday mornings, he ironed his shirt, shined his shoes, and sat 2 pews from the back at a brick church on Lenox. He bowed his head when the pastor talked about forgiveness, but the words slid right off him. You cannot forgive a shadow. You cannot forgive a man whose name you do not know. That was where Vinny Eyes first sat beside him. Italian suit, soft voice, hat in his hand out of respect for the house of God. He did not talk during the sermon. He waited until the last hymn ended, until people started to drift toward the doors. Then he leaned in without looking at Clarence. "Shame about your brother," he said. "City forgets boys like that." Clarence's fingers tightened on his hat brim. "You knew Delroy?" "I know what happened in that alley," Vinny replied. "I know whose boys were swinging, and I know who was signing their paychecks." He did not say Bumpy's name. He did not have to. Over the next months, Vinny appeared like a bad chorus line. Outside the church, at a small diner in the Bronx where Clarence grabbed coffee on his day off. At the corner near the bus stop. He never shoved, never shouted. He ordered food and never finished it. He paid for nothing, but he paid in something else. Information. Those men answered to somebody, Vinny told him over cold eggs and untouched toast. You cook for that somebody every night. You call him Mr. Johnson. You know his face when he smiles. Did you ever see his face when he sends people to the hospital? Clarence said nothing, but silence was its own kind of answer. Hate rarely explodes all at once. It seeps. It takes the shape of the container you pour your life into. For 8 years, Clarence poured his into the kitchen at the Red Rooster. Every plate perfect, every sauce reduced just right, every steak seared like a small prayer for the brother who never got to grow old. When you live with a wound that never got a name, your mind starts writing its own script. If no court listens, you build a courtroom in your head. If no judge steps up, you appoint yourself. Psychologists have a phrase for it: identity fused with trauma. You stop being just Clarence. You become the man whose brother died for nothing. Every decision you make curls back to that one night in '53. Vinny understood that. Predators usually do. One evening, outside the church steps, he finally said what he had been circling toward for months. "I can't bring your brother back," he told Clarence, "but I can put you in the same room with the man whose war got him killed. Same plates, same knife, same distance between his throat and your hand. You do the math." For a man who had been frozen in the same moment for 8 years, that sounded less like a crime and more like a chance to breathe. Revenge can feel a lot like oxygen to someone who has been choking on unsaid words. By the time glass met steak in November '61, Clarence had already lost more than he knew. He had traded in his future for one sharp moment of imagined justice. The night he sprinkled those ground shards over Bumpy's ribeye, he wasn't saving his life. He was spending it. The attempt failed. Bumpy walked out alive, with a napkin full of poisoned meat and a clock in his head. Nat and Juno followed the trail. It led not to some nameless hitman from downtown, but back to a small rooming house uptown, where the head chef of the Red Rooster sat with his bags half-packed and his hands shaking. They dragged Clarence out of that room after dark. No crowd, no police. Just 2 of Bumpy's men, and a car that smelled like stale smoke and leather. They took him not to a basement or a vacant lot, but back to the place where he had cooked his best meals. The Red Rooster kitchen, after closing, was a different animal. Stoves off, floors mopped, knives racked. Tonight, every member of the staff stood along the walls, jackets on, hats off, eyes fixed on the center of the tile floor. This was not a kitchen. It was a circle. They tied Clarence's hands in front of him. Juno stood on one side, Nat on the other. Bumpy stepped in last, coat still on, hat shadowing his eyes. If there had been a proper court, there would have been a judge on a raised bench, a clerk, a row of lawyers trading objections. Here, there was only an apron-wearing jury and a kingpin who had decided to play all 3 roles at once. Clarence had tried to kill a man. That was fact. He had ground up glass, folded it into butter, sent it out on fine china with a sprig of thyme. That was the crime every eye in the room could name. But he was also the brother of a 19-year-old who died under hospital lights because men on Bumpy's payroll swung too hard in the dark. That part never made it into any police report. That part lived only in the memory of a family and the conscience of the men who had ordered the chase. Bumpy looked from Clarence to Juno. "Tell it," he said. Juno's voice cracked as he talked about the alley, the wrong coat, the bat, the way Delroy had curled on the ground. He talked about the cheap coffin, the envelope of cash, the lie they handed the grieving family about random street trouble. By the end, no one in the room was just looking at Clarence anymore. They were looking at the machinery that had made both him and his rage possible. There were no clean hands in that kitchen, only different levels of dirty. Bumpy could have ended it fast. A gun, a basement, a hole in some far-off field. That was the simple script. Instead, he stood in front of the man who tried to poison him and did something far more dangerous. He admitted, in front of everyone, that if Delroy had never been beaten in that alley, they would not be standing here, that his empire had a body in its foundation. Understanding, though, is not the same thing as forgiveness. "Your brother died because of my war," Bumpy told him. "But you put glass in my food. You aimed at a king and you missed. There's a price for that." He nodded to the back of the room. "Open the freezer." The metal door swung wide, breathing out a wall of white air. The walk-in was set to 10 degrees below zero, cold enough to burn flesh slower than fire and hurt longer. Bumpy did not sentence Clarence to death. Not with a bullet, not with a blade. He sentenced his hands. The same hands that seasoned steaks, folded napkins, and once held his kid brother's shoulders in a hospital corridor. 8 hours, Bumpy said. He walks out breathing, but he never cooks again. It was a cruel mercy, or a merciful cruelty, depending on where you stood in that circle. In the world Bumpy ruled, justice was never just about what happened to one man. It was about the story everyone else would tell afterward. A dead chef would be a rumor. A broken chef with ruined fingers and a past everyone whispered about? That was a warning carved into living flesh. They led Clarence into the steel room and shut the door. The lock clicked. The hum of the compressor filled the silence like a verdict being written in cold air. Harlem would not see the minutes tick by inside that freezer, but it would remember the sentence. By the next morning, the freezer had done its work. They dragged Clarence out into the white light of the kitchen, breath coming in ragged clouds, skin the color of paper. His fingers were the worst. The tips had turned a sick gray, nails dark, joints stiff like someone else's hands sewn onto his wrists. A doctor on Bumpy's payroll took one look and shook his head. "He'll live," the man said. "His fingers won't." For a chef, that was a sentence all by itself. Bumpy stood over him, coat on, hat low. The rest of the staff gathered in doorways and corners, pretending to scrub counters that were already clean. He could have finished it there. One nod and Clarence would leave the building in a different kind of box. Instead, Bumpy held out an envelope. Thick, heavy. "You're done in New York," he told him. "You get on a bus. You don't come back. I'll see to your brother's grave." There was no apology. There was no handshake. Just money, an order, and the quiet promise that Delroy would finally get something better than a cheap wooden box and a crooked stone. A few days later, a new headstone went up in a Harlem cemetery, simple and clean, with 2 words carved deeper than the rest. Remembered always. Clarence left the city the way a lot of broke men did in the early 60s on a Greyhound pointed south, forehead against the window. Hands wrapped in bandages that would soon come off to reveal something worse. Miami greeted him with heat, bright sky, and kitchens that did not need another pair of damaged hands on the line. He found work in the back of a small place near the water. Not at the stove, at the sink. Plates came in stacked with half-eaten meals, lipstick on the rims, cigarette burns in the saucers. He scrubbed in silence, watching knives flash and pans jump over the flames a few feet away, like he was looking at an old life through thick glass. Back in Harlem, the story traveled faster than any bus. Here's the thing about what you've just heard. It was never typed up as an official verdict. You won't find 8 hours in a walk-in freezer on a court transcript. You won't see steak knife sent on ice in a police report. What you're hearing is the way Harlem kept its own record. Half memory, half myth, passed between barber chairs, church steps, and bar stools. The files from that era talk about assaults, racketeering, gambling, narcotics, dry words, case numbers, paragraphs that never mention a chef with ruined fingers or a new headstone on a forgotten boy's grave. The neighborhood filled in the missing pieces itself. It added the sharp edges, the frozen knife mailed to an Italian club, the white rose laid on Delroy's plot, the exact number of hours Clarence spent locked in the cold. Maybe some details got polished on the way from one mouth to the next. Maybe the freezer was a little warmer, or the bus left on a different day. But the core stays the same. A man tried to kill Bumpy Johnson, and instead of burying him, Bumpy buried his career and rewrote the rules for anyone thinking about taking a shot at the king. That's what stories like this do in a place where official justice barely shows up. They warn, they teach, they let people believe that someone, somewhere, is keeping score, even if the person holding the pen operates out of a brownstone instead of a courthouse. Back in Harlem, The story moved faster than the lunch rush. Cooks told it over cigarette breaks in alleyways. Bartenders whispered it between last call and closing. A chef had slipped glass into the king's steak. The king had locked him in a freezer for 8 hours and sent him away with ruined hands instead of a bullet. The moral was simple enough for everybody on the line to understand. If you aim for the king and miss, the rest of your life becomes the scar. A week later, an Italian social club downtown received a parcel. Inside the brown paper was a block of ice, clear and heavy, and trapped in the middle was a steak knife from the Red Rooster. No blood, no note, just 3 words scrawled on the wrapping in a flat, steady hand. Kitchens closed. Stay out of Harlem. Nobody in that room needed a translator. By the end of the month, the Italians had taken 1 step back from 127th Street. Not a retreat. Just a reminder that some borders weren't worth testing with cutlery. Some borders, and some graves. One afternoon, Bumpy stood alone in a Harlem cemetery, coat buttoned against the wind. In front of him, Delroy Mosley finally had a proper headstone. Clean stone, straight letters, a single white flower resting at the base. There were no reporters, no cops, no lawyers. Just a crime boss and a boy the city had filed away as street violence, unknown assailant. That's the quiet truth sitting under this whole story. When official justice goes missing, when no judge hears the case, when no detective loses sleep over a dead kid in a cheap suit, people start looking for justice wherever they can find it. In places like Harlem, that often means men like Bumpy Johnson. You get a little bit of what you should have had from the courts: a name, a grave, a reckoning. And in return, you accept that the man providing it doesn't answer to a robe or a badge. He answers only to his own line in the sand. Real power, the kind that lasts longer than fear, can't just be about who carries the biggest gun or runs the coldest freezer. It has to carry the weight of names nobody remembers. Kids like Delroy, workers like Clarence. Revenge doesn't balance the scales. It just piles more weight on both sides. Owning your damage, paying back a fraction of what you took, that's the thin line between a monster and a king with limits. So let me ask you, if it was your call, what would you have done with Clarence? 8 hours in the dark and a one-way ticket, or something softer, or something worse? And when the courts look the other way, do you put your faith in the kind of justice that comes from a bench, or the kind that comes from men like Bumpy, standing over a grave with a flower in their hand? Drop your verdict in the comments. And if you know someone who swears that revenge is the only real justice left in this world, send them this story and see if they still feel the same by the end.